The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one you notice first. Sometimes she's the one you dismiss before she even speaks. The conference room on the third floor of the Pentagon smelled of coffee and ambition. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow across a table surrounded by uniforms. Dress blues, army greens, the crisp khaki of Navy officers, all adorned with ribbons and insignia that proclaimed decades of service. These were the men who shaped policy, who moved assets across continents with the stroke of a pen, who spoke in acronyms that decided the fates of nations. And then there was Sarah Chen. She sat at the far end of the table, a slim woman in a gray blazer and simple pearl earrings, her dark hair pulled back in a practical twist. No uniform, no rank on her shoulders. Just a visitor's badge clipped to her lapel and a leather portfolio unopened before her. The generals barely glanced at her when she entered. One of them, a two-star with a face like weathered granite, had actually asked if she was there to take notes. She'd smiled politely and said no. Now, 20 minutes into the briefing on Operation Silent Hammer, she listened as the men debated tactical approaches to a problem they didn't fully understand. The target was a network of weapons traffickers operating across the Sahel region, funneling arms to extremist groups that had already destabilized 3 governments. Satellite imagery covered the table like a mosaic of secrets, showing compounds and convoy routes, and the scattered evidence of violence. "We hit them hard and fast," Colonel Marcus Webb was saying, his pointer tapping against a cluster of buildings on the map. "Surgical strike, in and out before they know what happened." "And what about the civilians in that compound?" asked a Navy captain. "Intelligence suggests there could be families living there. Collateral damage is always a risk. We minimize where we can." Sarah watched the exchange with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. She'd learned that skill in places far more dangerous than conference rooms, in cramped safe houses where the wrong word could mean death, in interrogation rooms where silence was the only weapon that mattered, in the long hours between contact when all you could do was watch and wait and pray. She knew things about this network that weren't in any satellite photo. She knew the names of the men who ran it, the weaknesses they hid behind their cruelty, the fractures in their organization that could be exploited without a single shot fired. She knew because she'd spent 18 months embedded in their world, wearing different names and different faces, building the kind of trust that took years to earn and seconds to destroy. But no one had asked her. General Morrison, the two-star who'd mistaken her for a secretary, was speaking now, his voice carrying the unquestioned authority of a man who'd never been ignored in his life. "The window is closing. We have assets in position. I say we move within 72 hours and end this." Around the table, heads nodded. The momentum was building toward a decision that Sarah knew would be catastrophic, not because the men making it were incompetent, but because they were operating with incomplete information. They saw the problem from 30,000 feet, in pixels and coordinates and threat assessments. They didn't see the child soldiers who'd been conscripted into the network, the informants who'd risked everything to provide intelligence, the fragile web of relationships that could unravel the entire operation without a single American boot on the ground. Sarah opened her portfolio. "General Morrison." Her voice was calm, unhurried, not loud, but somehow it cut through the ambient noise of male authority and made heads turn. The general looked at her with barely concealed impatience. "Yes? Before you authorize this strike, there are some things you should know." A subtle ripple of amusement passed through the room. Colonel Webb actually smiled, the indulgent smile of someone humoring a child who'd wandered into an adult conversation. "Ma'am, I appreciate your interest, but this is an operational matter. Perhaps you could share your concerns with the appropriate channels after the briefing." "The appropriate channel is this room," Sarah said. "And my concerns aren't concerns. They're intelligence that will determine whether your operation succeeds or fails." The amusement faded. General Morrison leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And you are?" "Sarah Chen, Senior Intelligence Officer, National Clandestine Service. I've been running the primary asset network in the Sahel for the past 18 months. Everything you know about this target, the compounds, the routes, the leadership structure, came from my sources." The silence that followed was profound. She could see them recalculating, their assumptions shifting like tectonic plates beneath the surface of their confidence. The woman in civilian clothes, the one they'd overlooked, the one they'd dismissed. She was the reason they were sitting in this room at all. Sarah continued, her voice steady. "The compound you're planning to strike is not the network's headquarters. It's a decoy, specifically designed to attract exactly the kind of attention you're giving it. The real command center is 40 kilometers north, in a building that doesn't appear on any of your imagery because it's disguised as a medical clinic. She pulled a photograph from her portfolio and slid it across the table. It showed a modest structure with a red crescent painted on the roof, surrounded by what looked like ordinary civilian activity. If you hit the decoy, you'll kill approximately 60 people, most of them women and children who are being held as human shields. The network leadership will disperse within hours, my assets will be compromised, and 18 months of intelligence work will be destroyed. The operation will be declared a success because you'll have photos of a burning building, but the network will be back to full strength within 6 months. Colonel Webb's face had gone rigid. How do we know this intelligence is accurate? Because I was in that clinic 3 weeks ago. I sat across from the network's second-in-command and shared tea while he explained their contingency plans. He trusted me because he believed I was someone else, someone I spent 2 years becoming. She paused, letting that sink in. I can give you the real target. I can give you the timing that will catch the leadership together, but only if you're willing to listen to what I know. General Morrison was staring at her with a new expression. Not quite respect, not yet, but something that might become respect if she proved herself useful. It was a look Sarah knew well. She'd been earning that look her entire career, one briefing at a time, one operation at a time. Why weren't we briefed on this before? He asked. You were. The intelligence was included in the package distributed last week. Annex G, pages 47 through 53. I wrote it myself. She watched as several officers shuffled through their folders, searching for pages they'd apparently never read. The annexes, the supplementary materials, the sections that didn't come with charts and satellite photos. Those were easy to skip, especially when they came from sources without stars on their shoulders. General Morrison found the pages first. His eyes moved across her words, and she saw the moment when understanding dawned, when he realized that the information he needed had been in front of him all along, buried in a document he'd dismissed because of where it came from. The timeline you propose, he said slowly. It's 3 weeks out. The network leadership meets monthly to coordinate shipments. The next meeting is in 19 days at the clinic. If we time the strike correctly, we can eliminate their command structure in a single operation. But it has to be precise. It has to be based on current ground-level intelligence, and it has to account for the assets I've spent 18 months developing. And if we move now, as planned, Sarah held his gaze, then I'll spend the next 5 years rebuilding what you destroyed in an afternoon, and the weapons will keep flowing, and the governments will keep falling, and eventually American soldiers will be sent to fight a war that could have been prevented. The room was very quiet. Sarah could feel the weight of their attention, the unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen for the first time since she'd walked through the door. It was a strange kind of victory, not triumph exactly, but the satisfaction of finally being heard. General Morrison closed his folder. I think we need to revisit our approach, he said. Ms. Chen, you have the floor. The night after the briefing, Sarah sat alone in her apartment in Arlington, watching the lights of the city blur through rain-streaked windows. A glass of wine stood untouched on the table beside her. She'd spent 4 hours walking the generals through her intelligence, answering their questions, deflecting their skepticism, building the case for an approach that had never occurred to them because they'd never thought to ask the person who knew the most about it. They'd agreed to her timeline. They'd agreed to her targets. They'd agreed to a plan that protected her assets and maximized the chance of success. It was everything she'd wanted, and yet the victory felt hollow somehow, a reminder of how close they'd come to disaster, of how easily her expertise had been overlooked. She thought about the network's second-in-command, a man named Musa who'd grown up in poverty and turned to violence because it was the only path to power he'd ever been shown. She'd spent hours with him, learning his story, earning his trust, seeing the human being beneath the monster. That was the hardest part of her work. Not the danger, but the intimacy. The knowledge that the people she was fighting were people, with fears and hopes and reasons for becoming who they'd become. In 3 weeks, Musa would probably be dead, and Sarah would be the one who'd made it possible. She'd sit in an operations center somewhere, watching drone feeds and listening to radio chatter, and she'd know that her 18 months of relationship building had led to this moment. This necessary, terrible moment when the relationships ended in fire. That was the weight she carried, the weight of knowing people deeply enough to destroy them. Her phone buzzed, a message from her handler. Nice work today. The brass is impressed. Sarah stared at the words, wondering what they meant. Impressed by what? By the intelligence she'd gathered at enormous personal risk. By her ability to navigate a room full of men who dismissed her on sight. by the fact that she'd prevented a catastrophe through sheer force of will. She didn't need their impression. She needed them to listen from the beginning, to value the intelligence before the crisis forced them to pay attention, to understand that the work happening in the shadows was just as important as the work happening in uniform. But that wasn't how the world operated, not yet, maybe not ever. Sarah finished her wine and went to bed. In 3 weeks, the operation would launch. Until then, she had work to do, assets to protect, intelligence to gather, relationships to maintain with people who would never know that their confidences were being recorded, analyzed, and prepared for use against them. This was the life she'd chosen, the quiet, patient, invisible work of intelligence, the kind of work that saved lives but never made headlines, the kind of work that required you to be exactly who others expected you to be, until the moment when being yourself was the only option left. 3 weeks. Later, Sarah stood in an operations center at Fort Bragg, surrounded by screens displaying feeds from half a dozen sources. The room was crowded with military personnel and intelligence officers, all focused on the mission unfolding in real time 8,000 miles away. The strike team had inserted overnight, 12 operators from a unit that officially didn't exist, supported by drones and surveillance assets that had been tracking the target for weeks. Sarah had provided the final intelligence, the layout of the clinic, the location of the leadership meeting room, the timing of the guards' rotations, everything her assets had risked their lives to provide. Now, all she could do was watch. On the central screen, thermal imagery showed the clinic building, a bright rectangle against the cooler darkness of the surrounding terrain. Inside, heat signatures moved with the casual rhythms of people who didn't know they were being watched. Sarah counted them automatically, matching the shapes to the faces she knew. Musa, probably the tall figure near the center. The network leader, a man named Ibrahim, likely seated at the head of the table. The lieutenants and enforcers who kept the operation running. 8 months ago, she'd sat in a cafe in Niamey with Ibrahim, listening to him describe his vision for a new order in the region. A vision built on weapons and violence, but articulated with the passion of a true believer. He'd looked at her with eyes that held both cruelty and conviction, and she'd seen the dangerous complexity of a man who genuinely believed he was building something better. She'd smiled and nodded and asked careful questions, and all the while she'd been memorizing details that would eventually lead to this moment. "Strike team is in position," a voice announced, awaiting authorization. General Morrison stood at the center of the room, flanked by staff officers and communication specialists. He'd aged somehow in the 3 weeks since the Pentagon briefing, not in appearance but in awareness. He looked at Sarah before he spoke, a brief acknowledgement that carried more weight than any medal or commendation. "Execute." On the screen, the heat signatures began to move, sharp, coordinated movements as the strike team breached the building from multiple entry points. Sarah watched as the shapes collapsed or scattered, as the careful choreography of violence played out in silent thermal imagery. The radio chatter was controlled, professional, almost casual, the voices of men doing work they had trained for their entire lives. It was over in 4 minutes, 8 hostiles down, no friendly casualties. The network leadership eliminated in a single, precise operation. Around her, the room erupted in controlled celebration, handshakes and backslaps, and the release of tension that had been building for weeks. This was the moment they'd worked for, the culmination of planning and coordination and the kind of split-second execution that separated success from disaster. Sarah felt none of it. She was thinking about Musa, about the conversation they'd had on a rooftop in Ouagadougou while the sun set over the city. He'd talked about his children, 3 daughters he'd sent to school, despite the disapproval of his colleagues, because he wanted them to have choices he'd never had. He'd shown her their photographs, his face softening in a way that seemed impossible for a man who'd done the things he'd done. Those daughters would grow up without a father now. They'd never know that the woman who'd shared tea with him and listened to his dreams had been the one to bring his death. They'd only know the absence, the grief, the unanswered questions that would follow them forever. That was the cost of the work, the invisible price paid by everyone it touched. 12 hours after the operation, Sarah sat in a secure briefing room at Langley, delivering her after-action report to a small audience of senior intelligence officials. The slides on the screen behind her showed the damage, the network dismantled, the leadership eliminated, the weapons pipeline disrupted in ways that would take years to rebuild. It was a complete success by every measurable standard, and yet. "The concerning element," she said, advancing to her next slide, "is what we didn't accomplish. The network's financing structure remains largely intact. Their connections to extremist groups in northern Mali have not been severed, and the conditions that allowed this network to flourish, poverty, instability, lack of governance, remain unchanged. A senior official frowned. Those are strategic problems. Our job was tactical. With respect, sir, there is no tactical solution to a strategic problem. We've cut off the head, but the body will regenerate unless we address the underlying causes. The weapons will flow again, the instability will continue, and in 5 years, we'll be sitting in another briefing room discussing another operation against another network that grew from the same roots. The room was quiet. Sarah knew she was pushing boundaries, speaking truths that nobody wanted to hear in the glow of a successful operation. But she'd learned long ago that the moments after victory were the most important. The moments when people were willing to listen, when the door to change stood briefly open. "What are you proposing?" another official asked. "Integration, not just between intelligence and military, but between all the elements of national power. We need development programs that give young men alternatives to violence. We need governance support that helps legitimate authorities provide security. We need sustained engagement, not one-off operations." She paused. "And we need to listen to the people on the ground, the assets who risk everything to help us, the analysts who spend years understanding these problems, the officers who see the patterns that satellites can't capture." The senior official who'd spoken first leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Those are expensive propositions in an era of budget constraints. They're less expensive than the alternative. Every network we dismantle without addressing root causes will be replaced. Every operation we execute without local engagement will create new enemies. We can keep fighting the same wars forever, or we can start thinking differently about what victory actually means." She saw some nods, some skepticism, some faces carefully neutral. It was the same reaction she always got when she spoke uncomfortable truths, the mixture of agreement and resistance that defined every attempt at institutional change. But that was fine. She wasn't expecting revolution. She was expecting to plant seeds that might someday grow into something better. That was the real intelligence work. Not just gathering information, but shaping how that information was used. Not just supporting operations, but influencing the thinking that determined which operations were necessary. One briefing at a time, one conversation at a time, one uncomfortable truth at a time. 2 months after the operation, Sarah returned to the region. Not for another mission, not directly, but to close the loops her work had left open, to meet with the assets who'd survived, to ensure their safety, to acknowledge the risks they'd taken and the price they'd paid. She met Henry in a cafe in Dakar, a crowded place where their conversation would be lost in the ambient noise of commerce and gossip. He was older now, or maybe just more worn, the lines in his face deeper than she remembered. He'd been her primary source for 18 months, feeding her information at enormous personal risk, and now his usefulness was at an end. "The network is broken," she told him quietly. "Your family will be safe. The extraction plan is in place. You can leave whenever you're ready." Henry stirred his coffee slowly, not meeting her eyes. "And then what? A new life in some country where I know no one, where my work means nothing?" "It means everything. The people you helped save, they're alive because of you. But they don't know that. They'll never know that. I'll spend the rest of my life in silence, knowing what I've done but unable to speak of it." He finally looked up at her. "Is that what you live with too? The silence?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She thought about the weight she carried, the operations she'd enabled, the lives she'd saved, and the lives she'd ended, the intimate knowledge of people she'd been required to betray. The silence was the heaviest part, the inability to share what she knew, to process what she'd experienced, to be fully known by anyone. "Yes," she said finally, "but the silence has a purpose. It protects the people who come after us. It protects the work." "And who protects us?" It was a question she couldn't answer. In the intelligence world, there were no parades, no monuments, no public acknowledgement of sacrifice. The work existed in shadows, and those who did it became shadows themselves, present but unseen, essential but invisible. "We protect each other," she said. "That's all we have." Henry nodded slowly, and she saw something shift in his eyes. Not acceptance exactly, but a kind of resignation. The understanding that some prices had no refund, some choices no reversal. They'd both made those choices. They'd both have to live with them. "I'll take the extraction," he said, "but I want you to know something first. In all the time I worked with you, I never knew who you really were. You were many people, a businesswoman, a journalist, a humanitarian worker, but never yourself. And yet somehow, I trusted you more than anyone I've ever known." Sarah felt the weight of his words, the strange intimacy of their relationship. They'd shared secrets that could get them both killed, built a partnership on lies and necessity, developed a bond that transcended the professional. And yet, he was right. He'd never known her. Not really, she'd never allowed it. The person you trusted was real, she said. The details were different, but the core was true. I hope that counts for something. It counts for everything, Henry said. It's the only thing that made any of this bearable. They finished their coffee in silence. Two people who'd changed the course of events and would never be able to tell anyone. Two people who'd found trust in a world of betrayal and now had to learn how to live without the work that had defined them. When they parted, Henry shook her hand. A formal gesture, oddly appropriate for two people who'd never been allowed to be informal. Sarah watched him walk away into the Dakar crowds, another asset returning to a life she'd never know, another relationship ending with the operation. That was the work. That was always the work. Years later, Sarah Chen sat in a different conference room, watching a new generation of intelligence officers receive their briefing on a new crisis in a new part of the world. She wore civilian clothes, as always, a habit she'd never broken, even now that her role was acknowledged rather than dismissed. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same practical twist, and her eyes held the same patient stillness. She was a legend now, though the word embarrassed her. The declassified portions of her career had become training case studies. Her methods were taught in courses she'd never attended. Young officers spoke her name with reverence, unaware of the weight it carried. But legends were just stories, and stories never captured the truth. The truth was the nights she couldn't sleep, replaying decisions that had seemed right at the time and felt less certain with every passing year. The truth was the faces she still saw in dreams, assets who'd trusted her, enemies she'd understood too well, civilians caught in operations she'd enabled. The truth was the silence that still defined her life, the inability to be fully known by anyone who hadn't walked the same path. The briefing ended and the room emptied. Sarah remained, studying the maps and photographs that covered the table, the familiar imagery of threat and opportunity, the puzzle pieces that someone would have to assemble into action. A young officer lingered at the door, clearly working up courage to approach. Sarah recognized the look, the combination of intimidation and curiosity that her reputation inspired. She waved the young woman forward. "Ma'am, I was wondering if I could ask you something." "Go ahead. How did you do it? All those years, all those operations. How did you keep going when no one knew what you were accomplishing?" Sarah considered the question. It was the question every young officer asked, in various forms, seeking the secret that would make the work sustainable. But there was no secret. There was only the doing. "You don't do it for recognition," she said finally. "You do it because the work matters, because someone has to be in those rooms, providing the intelligence that prevents disasters, because if you don't do it, the people who come after you will face worse odds. But the cost is real. You'll carry it forever. But so will the people you protect in their own way. The lives they live without knowing how close they came to losing them. That's the trade. Invisible sacrifice for invisible safety." The young officer nodded slowly, not fully understanding. No one could until they'd lived it, but absorbing what she could. "There's something else," Sarah added. "Something they don't teach in training." "What's that?" "The people who dismiss you. The ones who overlook you because you don't wear a uniform, because you're a woman, because you don't fit their idea of what an intelligence officer looks like. They're not your enemies. They're your opportunity. Every time someone underestimates you, they give you space to operate. Every time they ignore you, they show you where the gaps in their awareness are." She paused, remembering the conference room in the Pentagon, the generals who'd barely glanced at her, the moment when she'd opened her portfolio and changed the course of an operation. The goal isn't to prove them wrong. The goal is to do the work so well that proving them wrong becomes inevitable. And then, maybe, the next person who looks like you won't have to prove anything at all. The young officer's eyes held something Sarah recognized. The fire of someone who'd chosen this path not for glory or recognition, but because the work called to them in ways they couldn't fully explain. "Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me. Just do the work. That's the only thanks any of us ever needed." That evening, Sarah walked alone through the grounds of the headquarters complex, watching the sunset paint the Virginia sky in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the building behind her, analysts were poring over intelligence. Officers were planning operations. Young men and women were beginning careers that would take them to places they couldn't imagine. She thought about all the rooms she'd walked into as a stranger, all the skeptical faces she'd converted into allies, all the moments when the quiet work of intelligence had made the difference between catastrophe and survival. She thought about Henri, probably living somewhere under a new name, carrying secrets he could never share. She thought about Moose's daughters, growing up in a region that was slightly safer because of choices their father's killer had made. The weight never got lighter. That was the lesson she'd learned, the truth she'd carried for 3 decades. The weight just became familiar, a part of you, something you learned to walk with rather than something you hoped to set down. But there was another truth, equally important. The weight was worth carrying. The invisible work mattered. The shadows served a purpose. Sarah Chen had spent her life being overlooked, until she wasn't. Until the moment when her expertise became undeniable, when her intelligence became essential, when the woman in civilian clothes became the most important person in the room. She'd never sought recognition. She'd never needed it. The work was its own justification, its own reward. And somewhere, in conference rooms and safe houses and operations centers around the world, the next generation was learning the same lesson. That true influence didn't come from rank or uniform, but from the patient, persistent work of knowing things that others didn't. That was the legacy she'd leave. Not medals or monuments, but a way of working, a way of being. The quiet understanding that the most powerful person in any room might be the one everyone else has overlooked. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the lights of the complex began to glow against the gathering darkness. Sarah turned and walked back toward the building, toward the work that never ended, toward the weight she'd chosen to carry. She didn't call herself a hero. She never had. But every officer who knew her story still told it. Because courage like that doesn't fade. It's passed on. History doesn't remember the quiet acts of courage. But maybe it should. Maybe that's what stories are for. To honor the ones who stood in shadows, who spoke truth to power, who proved their worth not through uniforms or ranks, but through the patient daily work of being exactly who they needed to be, until the moment when they revealed who they really were. And the room fell silent, and everything changed.